They thought I was just another engineer, disposable and forgettable. They never imagined that the $50 patch I proposed would transform into a $9.5 million legal nightmare. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I simply let them walk into the trap they insisted didn't exist. My name is Samantha Holt, and this is the story of how corporate arrogance became the most expensive lesson River Rock Logistics ever learned. I'd been with River Rock for 8 years when Greg Lawson swept in like a hurricane dressed in an Armani suit. Our new COO arrived with a reputation for aggressive cost-cutting and a smile that never reached his eyes. Within his first week, he'd already eliminated the free coffee in the break room and canceled 3 vendor contracts he deemed excessive. The man could find fat to trim in a skeleton. At 36, I'd carved out a comfortable niche as a systems management engineer. Not glamorous work, but essential. I kept the digital arteries of our mid-sized logistics company flowing smoothly, preventing the clots that could stop hundreds of shipments dead in their tracks. My colleagues joked that I could hear a server hiccup from 3 floors away. They weren't entirely wrong. The morning that changed everything started like any other. I arrived at 7:30, coffee in hand, ready to tackle the overnight error logs. That's when I found a vulnerability in our shipment tracking system so small it barely registered as a blip. But I'd learned long ago that in the world of cybersecurity, the tiniest cracks often lead to the biggest collapses. The fix was simple, a patch that would take me maybe 2 hours to implement, mostly testing. The software license would cost $50. Pocket change for a company handling millions in logistics contracts daily. I documented everything meticulously, as always, and submitted the request through proper channels. 2 days later, I stood in Greg's corner office, watching him flip through my report with the expression of someone forced to read a grocery list. $50, he said, tapping the number with his Mont Blanc pen. For a theoretical vulnerability. It's not theoretical, I replied, keeping my voice steady. It's an active security gap. Small now, but nothing. He tossed the report aside. Do you know what our legal department costs us annually? 7 figures? You think some hypothetical hacker is going to bring down a company this size through your little glitch? I wanted to explain that data breaches didn't care about company size, that hackers specifically targeted logistics companies for their treasure troves of customer information. Instead, I watched him lean back in his leather chair, already dismissing me from his thoughts. We're not a tech startup, Samantha. We move packages from point A to point B. Let's focus on what actually matters: operational efficiency. I've got a meeting with investors next week, and they want to see reduced overhead, not paranoid spending on maybes. The dismissal stung more than it should have. Not because he'd rejected the fix I'd had proposals turned down before. It was the casual arrogance, the way he'd relegated 8 years of expertise to paranoia. As I left his office, his assistant was already ushering in the next appointment. I'd been allotted exactly 6 minutes of his time. I returned to my desk and stared at the vulnerability report. Such a small thing, a missing validation check that could, under the right circumstances, allow unauthorized access to our shipment database. The kind of oversight that happens when systems grow organically over years, patched and repatched until the original architecture resembles digital spaghetti. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could implement the fix anyway, pay the $50 myself, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the principle. Or maybe, looking back, some part of me already knew what was coming. I filed the report away, both digitally and physically, 3 copies. Actually, 1 in my work files, 1 on my personal cloud storage, and a hard copy that I slipped into my laptop bag. Call it paranoia. But I'd learned to document everything. In the corporate world, paper trails were better than armor. The next few weeks passed in deceptive normalcy. I continued my daily routines, monitoring systems, optimizing databases, putting out the small fires that threatened to become infernos. But beneath the surface, changes were already in motion. It started with the algorithm. 3 years earlier, while still doing freelance work on the side, I developed a route optimization algorithm that could shave 15% off delivery times by analyzing traffic patterns, weather data, and driver histories. It was elegant code, the kind of solution that made other engineers whistle appreciatively. I'd licensed it to River Rock through my personal LLC, Holt Integration, with a specific agreement that allowed them to use it as long as certain conditions were met. One of those conditions, buried in subsection 3.2.4 of the licensing agreement, required that any system running my algorithm maintain specific security standards. It seemed like boilerplate at the time, the kind of technical requirement lawyers include to cover all bases. I'd insisted on it after watching too many companies treat security as an afterthought. The first sign of trouble came when Greg hired Marcus Webb, a 27-year-old systems innovation director who looked like he'd stepped out of a Silicon Valley recruitment poster. Trendy glasses, designer sneakers, and a vocabulary peppered with words like disruption and paradigm shift. He took an immediate interest in my algorithm. "This is solid work," Marcus admitted during our first meeting, scrolling through the code on his tablet. "But it's a bit traditional. We need to think bigger. Blockchain integration. Maybe some machine learning elements." "The algorithm already incorporates predictive modeling," I pointed out. "Adding blockchain would actually slow down processing without providing any real benefit for our use case." He smiled the way people do when they think you're adorably behind the times. "That's the old way of thinking, Samantha. We need to position ourselves for the future." Over the following weeks, I watched Marcus hold meeting after meeting about reimagining our routing system, meetings I was increasingly excluded from. My access permissions began to shrink, ostensibly for security compartmentalization. The irony wasn't lost on me; they were restricting my access in the name of security while ignoring actual security vulnerabilities. Then came the intellectual property meeting. Greg's assistant scheduled it for 4:30 on a Friday, that dead zone when everyone's already mentally checked out for the weekend. The conference room was full of suits legal, HR, and several executives I rarely interacted with. "We're streamlining our IP portfolio," Greg announced, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "Consolidating all employee-developed innovations under the corporate umbrella. Standard procedure." I read through the agreement carefully, my stomach tightening with each page. It was a broad IP assignment, the kind that would give River Rock ownership of everything I'd created, was creating, or might create in the future, including specifically any algorithms or optimization tools. "This would override my existing licensing agreement," I said. "Supersede," the head of legal corrected. "And yes, that's the idea. Cleaner ownership structure, better for everyone." "Better for the company," I clarified. Greg's smile tightened. "We are the company, Samantha. Team players understand that." I spent the weekend consulting with my own lawyer, a friend from college who'd specialized in intellectual property law. She confirmed what I already suspected: signing would effectively hand over my algorithm without compensation beyond my regular salary. Monday morning, I returned with a counteroffer. I'd signed the general IP agreement with a specific carve-out for pre-existing licensed works. My algorithm would remain under the original licensing terms. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees when I presented this. "That's not how this works," Greg said quietly. "You're either part of this team or you're not." "I'm absolutely part of this team, but I'm also a business owner who licensed specific technology to this company under specific terms. Those are two separate relationships." What followed was a 2-hour negotiation that felt more like a siege. They pushed. I held firm, finally, perhaps realizing that forcing the issue might lead to an even messier situation. They agreed to a modified version. The algorithm remained under its original license, but with additional language that seemed redundant at the time. I should have seen it for what it was: a strategic retreat, not a victory. The isolation began immediately. My input was no longer requested for system updates. Meetings happened without me. Marcus began referring to our routing system in company communications, with no mention of its origins. When I confronted him, he seemed genuinely puzzled. "I thought we were all working together here," he said. "No need to get territorial about code." I wanted to scream that it wasn't about territory. It was about years of work, elegant solutions to complex problems, intellectual property that I'd carefully protected. Instead, I documented each instance, building a file that grew thicker by the day. The final insult came when I discovered Marcus presenting his revolutionary routing algorithm to a group of potential investors. I watched through the glass conference room walls as he walked them through PowerPoint slides featuring my code. Restructured and rebranded, but fundamentally unchanged. The only addition was a colorful UI that added nothing to functionality. but apparently impressed people who thought good code needed to look pretty. I burst into Greg's office without knocking. "That's my algorithm Marcus is presenting." Greg didn't even look up from his monitor. "It's the company's algorithm, running on company servers, modified by company employees. I think you're confused about how corporate assets work." "I'm not confused about anything. That code is licensed, not owned, and Marcus hasn't modified it, he's put lipstick on it." Now he did look up, and his expression was pitying. "Samantha, I understand you're feeling threatened. Change is hard, but we need team players here, not prima donnas who think they own every line of code they've ever touched." "I do own it, legally. Check the licensing agreement." Our legal team has reviewed it extensively. Your little LLC licensed the algorithm to us. We're using it. I don't see the problem." "The problem is, you're presenting it as proprietary technology to investors without attribution, and you're ignoring the security requirements in the license." His face darkened. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm informing you of legal realities. Get out of my office." I left, but not before making one last attempt. "The security patch, Greg, $50. This is all connected. You can't cherry-pick which parts of agreements to honor." Out. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in corporate ostracization. My keycard suddenly stopped working for the executive floor. My parking spot was reassigned to a more senior employee. IT tickets. I submitted went unanswered. When I tried to update critical system documentation, I found my right access revoked. Then came the Thursday that would define everything after. I arrived to find my computer locked, my desk contents boxed, and Helen from HR waiting with a security guard. "Budget constraints," she said, not meeting my eyes. "We're eliminating redundant positions." Redundant, after 8 years. "It's nothing personal. Marcus will be taking over your responsibilities. We're confident the transition will be smooth." I almost laughed. Marcus couldn't debug his way out of a paper bag, but he could certainly present other people's work with flair. The exit interview was brief. I signed the standard documents, collected my personal items, and handed over my company laptop. Helen seemed relieved when I didn't make a scene. If only she knew what was coming. As I walked to my car, box in hand, I felt strangely calm. They thought they'd won. They'd taken my work, ignored my warnings, and discarded me like obsolete hardware. But they'd forgotten one crucial detail. The licensing agreement was still in effect, and they'd just eliminated the only person who understood its implications. I spent the next week organizing my documentation, every email, every report, every timestamp, the vulnerability assessment I'd submitted, the licensing agreement with its security requirements, the trail of meetings where my algorithm was rebranded, the exit paperwork showing I was terminated for redundancy while my responsibilities were reassigned. My lawyer friend, Rebecca, reviewed everything with growing excitement. "They've handed you a gift," she said. "They've explicitly violated the licensing terms while simultaneously preventing you from ensuring compliance. This is textbook bad faith." "I don't want to sue them," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they were true. "You might not have to, just wait." So I waited, 3 weeks, to be exact. The call came at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, unknown number, but I recognized Helen's voice immediately. "Samantha, we need you to come in. There's been an incident." "I don't work for River Rock anymore, remember?" "Please, it's urgent. Greg wants to speak with you." "Greg can speak to my attorney." I hung up and turned off my phone. The vultures could circle until morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the story was all over tech news sites. River Rock Logistics had suffered a data breach. Customer information for thousands of shipments' names, addresses, tracking numbers. Some payment data had been accessed through exactly the vulnerability I'd identified, the one that would have cost $50 to fix. My phone became a lightning storm of missed calls and messages. River Rock's legal team, Greg personally, even Marcus, all suddenly very interested in reconnecting. I let them stew while I prepared my response. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 2. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in my best suit, accompanied by Rebecca and 2 senior partners from her firm. The River Rock side of the table looked like they'd aged years and days. Greg's usual swagger had evaporated, replaced by something that might have been fear. "We need your help," he began without preamble. "The breach." "The breach occurred through a vulnerability I documented and proposed fixing 6 weeks ago," I interrupted. "A fix you personally rejected." We can discuss past decisions later. Right now, we need—" "You need nothing from me. I'm no longer an employee. Remember, eliminated for redundancy." One of their lawyers leaned forward. "Ms. Holt, surely you understand the situation. Customer data has been compromised. This affects real people." "I understood that 6 weeks ago. Your client didn't—" Rebecca took over. "My client is sympathetic to the situation, but she has her own concerns, specifically, the unauthorized use and misrepresentation of her proprietary algorithm." "What unauthorized use?" Greg sputtered. "We have a license." "A license with specific security requirements," Rebecca continued smoothly. "Requirements that were demonstrably not met, as evidenced by this breach. The license clearly states that failure to maintain specified security standards results in immediate termination of usage rights." The color drained from Greg's face as he began to understand. "Furthermore," Rebecca added, "presenting the algorithm to investors as proprietary Riverrock technology constitutes fraud. My client has documentation of meetings where her licensed technology was explicitly misrepresented as internal innovation." "This is extortion," one of their lawyers said. "This is consequence," I replied. The negotiations that followed were brutal. Riverrock was facing customer lawsuits over the breach, potential regulatory fines, and now the loss of the routing algorithm that they'd pitched to investors as a key competitive advantage. Removing it would cripple their operations. Continuing to use it would mean accepting liability for willful copyright infringement. We left that meeting without resolution, but I knew they'd cave. They had no choice. The lawsuit, when I filed it the following Monday, was a thing of beauty. Copyright infringement, breach of contract, fraud, and defamation for claiming my work as their own. The damages request was structured precisely actual damages from the misuse of my algorithm, punitive damages for willful infringement, and legal fees. Riverrock tried to negotiate. They offered my job back with a promotion. They offered a buyout of the algorithm. They even offered to make me CTO. Each offer was rejected with a simple response, "See you in court." Discovery was where things got interesting. Internal emails surfaced showing Greg had specifically instructed the legal team to find ways to circumvent my licensing agreement. Marcus had been hired with the explicit goal of reimagining my algorithm to create plausible deniability. The security vulnerability hadn't just been ignored, it had been deemed acceptable risk in writing. The smoking gun came from Greg's own inbox, an email to the board, sent the day after rejecting my security patch. "Holt's paranoia about security is why we need fresh blood in tech. Marcus understands that moving fast is more important than imaginary threats." The data breach had cost Riverrock $3 million in immediate damages, customer settlements, credit monitoring services, regulatory fines. Their stock price dropped 12%. 3 major contracts were canceled, but that was just the beginning. The copyright infringement case was straightforward. They'd violated the license terms, continued using the algorithm anyway, and profited from it. The judge was particularly unsympathetic to their claim that security requirements were suggestions rather than obligations. "If I lease you a car with the requirement that you maintain the brakes," she said during one hearing, "and you choose not to maintain the brakes, and then crash into someone's living room, you don't get to keep driving the car while arguing about whether brake maintenance was really necessary." The fraud component was even more damaging. 3 investors testified that Riverrock's proprietary routing algorithm had been a key factor in their decision to invest. When they learned it was actually licensed technology that Riverrock no longer had legal right to use, they wanted their money back, with interest and penalties. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I spent 3 days on the stand, walking through documentation, explaining the technology, detailing each violation. Greg's cross-examination was painful to watch. His own emails condemned him at every turn. "You called my security concerns paranoia," I said at one point. "You rejected a $50 fix that would have prevented a $3 million breach. You systematically excluded me from my own work, then fired me to avoid honoring our agreement. Every choice you made led directly to this moment." His lawyer tried to object, but the judge overruled. The witness is responding directly to the question about causation. Continue, Ms. Holt. The verdict came down on a Wednesday. Guilty on all counts. The damages were itemized with brutal precision. Copyright infringement, $2.5 million. Breach of contract, $1.5 million. Fraud, $3 million. Legal fees, $1.2 million. Punitive damages, $1.3 million. Total $9.5 million. Greg found me in the parking lot after the verdict. He looked like a broken man. You destroyed me, he said. Over $50. No, I corrected. You destroyed yourself over $50. I just documented it. I'll be forced to sell my shares. My career is over. Choices have consequences. Greg, you chose to ignore expertise. You chose to steal work. You chose to put ego over security. Every single choice was yours. He stood there for a moment, perhaps searching for words that might change something. Finding none. He walked away. I never saw him again. The settlement negotiations were brief. River Rock couldn't afford to appeal. Not with their stock in freefall and investors demanding blood. They paid in full within 30 days. I used the money to expand Holt Integration LLC, hiring 2 developers and a salesperson. Within 6 months, I'd signed 3 contracts with River Rock's former clients, companies that had lost faith in their security after the breach. The irony was delicious. I was now making more from their competitors than I'd ever made from them. Marcus lasted another month before being quietly let go. I heard through the grapevine that he'd tried to claim credit for identifying security vulnerabilities after the fact. Even a wounded company has limits on the lies it will tolerate. The speaking engagement came as a surprise. Tech conferences usually want visionaries and disruptors, not engineers who document everything and file lawsuits. But apparently, the $50 fix had become something of a legend in cybersecurity circles. I stood before an audience of 500 IT professionals. My presentation slides simple and unadorned. No fancy animations or trendy graphics, just facts, timelines, and consequences. Security is like insurance, I told them. It costs money to maintain, and nothing happens when it works. That makes it an easy target for cost cutters and ego-driven executives who think bad things happen to other companies. I clicked to a slide showing the vulnerability report I'd submitted. Such a small thing on the screen, barely visible from the back rows. This fix would have cost $50. The breach cost $3 million. The lawsuit cost $9.5 million. The reputation damage is still being calculated, all because someone thought they knew better than the person they'd hired to know better. The questions afterwards were pointed and practical. How to document properly, how to protect intellectual property, how to recognize when a company doesn't deserve your expertise. I answered them all with the same calm precision I'd once brought to debugging code. But what if they retaliate? One young engineer asked. What if standing up for yourself costs you your job? It might, I admitted. It cost me mine. But ask yourself this. Do you want to work for a company that punishes expertise, that steals ideas and ignores warnings? Your skills have value. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The conference ended with unexpected applause. Not the polite golf clap of professional obligation, but genuine appreciation from people who'd been in similar situations, who'd had their warnings ignored and their work stolen. Afterwards, I had dinner with Rebecca and her partners. They'd made a fortune from the case, but more importantly, they'd set precedent. The ruling was already being cited in other intellectual property disputes. You know they're using you as a case study in business schools now, Rebecca mentioned over dessert. What not to do when your engineer identifies a critical vulnerability. Good. Maybe it'll save some other company from Greg Lawson's style of leadership. Speaking of which, did you hear he started a consulting firm, Lawson Leadership Solutions, specializing in cost optimization? We shared a laugh at that. Some people never learn. The waiter brought the check, and I reached for it automatically. This one's on me, Rebecca protested. No, I said firmly. I've got it. After all, I can afford it now. As I signed the credit card receipt, I thought about the journey from that morning when I'd found the vulnerability. Such a small thing. A missing validation check, $50 to fix, $9.5 million to ignore. My phone buzzed with an email. Another company reaching out, interested in my security consulting services. They'd heard about the River Rock case. They said they wanted to make sure their systems were bulletproof. I smiled and pocketed the phone. Tomorrow, I'd review their infrastructure, identify their vulnerabilities, and quote them a fair price for fixes. And if they balked at the cost, if they suggested that security was paranoia, if they tried to marginalize my expertise, well, I'd document that too. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, though it certainly felt good to watch Greg's hubris crumble. Not even justice, though the verdict provided that in abundance. It's about value, understanding it, protecting it, and demanding it be recognized. My algorithm still runs at the heart of 3 major logistics networks now, properly licensed and carefully maintained. My security protocols have prevented dozens of breaches that never made the news because they never happened. My documentation practices have become industry standard in several firms. And somewhere, in a business school classroom, students are learning about the executive who thought he could save $50 by ignoring an engineer's warning. They're calculating the true cost of arrogance, studying the legal implications of intellectual property theft, understanding why expertise matters more than ego. I hope they remember the lesson when they enter the corporate world. I hope they value their engineers, respect their warnings, and pay for their patches. I hope they understand that in the digital age, the smallest vulnerabilities can bring down the mightiest companies. But if they don't, if they choose the path of Greg Lawson, prioritizing short-term savings over long-term security, then I hope their engineers are taking notes. Because $50 is such a small price to pay to avoid a $9.5 million lesson. The parking lot was empty now except for my Tesla, a recent indulgence that I'd paid for in cash. As I walked toward it, my heels clicking on the asphalt, I thought about the young engineer who'd asked about retaliation. What I hadn't told her, what I couldn't quite articulate in that moment, was that sometimes losing a job is the best thing that can happen to you. River Rock had given me steady employment for 8 years. They'd also limited my growth, undervalued my contributions, and ultimately tried to steal my best work. Getting fired had forced me to recognize my own worth, to stop accepting crumbs when I'd been baking the whole cake. Holt Integration LLC now had 12 employees and contracts worth more than I'd ever dreamed of managing. We specialized in security audits and custom algorithm development, with a reputation for bulletproof code and meticulous documentation. Every contract included ironclad intellectual property protections. Every client understood that they were licensing expertise, not buying ownership of it. My phone rang as I reached the car. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code Silicon Valley. Ms. Holt, this is Jennifer Chen from Apex Ventures. We're looking for a security consultant for our portfolio companies. Your name keeps coming up. I'm listening, I said, already knowing I'd take the meeting, not because I needed the work, but because somewhere in that portfolio might be another Greg Lawson, another executive who thought security was optional and expertise was replaceable. And if there was, I'd give them the same opportunity I'd given Greg the chance to listen to someone who knew better. Whether they took that chance, well, that would be up to them. But I'd document their choice either way. As I drove home through the city lights, I allowed myself one moment of pure satisfaction, not from the money, though financial security was nice, not from the vindication, though being proven right had its appeal, but from the knowledge that I'd stood up for the value of expertise in a world that increasingly wanted to commoditize it. Greg Lawson had thought he was getting a bargain by refusing to spend $50. Marcus Webb had thought he could repackage brilliance with a fresh UI and call it innovation. River Rock's board had thought they could own what they'd only leased. They'd all learned otherwise. And somewhere tonight, in server rooms and home offices around the world, engineers were documenting vulnerabilities, protecting their code, and knowing their worth. Some of them had heard my story. Others would face their own Greg Lawsons and make their own choices. But they'd all understand the fundamental truth that River Rock learned too late: expertise has value. Security has a price, and the cost of ignoring both is always higher than you think. $50. Such a small number. Such an expensive lesson. I pulled into my driveway, the security lights automatically illuminating as they detected my car. Another small system, working invisibly to prevent problems before they occurred, just like good engineers do. When companies let them, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients, new vulnerabilities to patch. But tonight, I'd pour a glass of wine, review my latest contracts, and sleep soundly knowing that my work was protected, my value was recognized, and my documentation was impeccable. Because in the end, that's the best revenge of all, not destroying those who wronged you, but building something they can never touch again. Greg Lawson had handed me the blueprint for my own success when he'd refused to spend $50. I'd simply followed it to its logical conclusion. $9.5 million. Every penny of it earned not through malice or manipulation, but through meticulous preparation and unshakable belief in the value of expertise. The house was dark except for the study where I kept my home office. I flipped on the lights and looked at the framed vulnerability report hanging on the wall, my $50 trophy. Some people mounted deer heads or displayed sports memorabilia. I showcased the document that changed my life. My laptop chimed with new emails, 3 potential clients, 2 conference invitations, and 1 message that made me pause. The sender was listed as former River Rock employee. Ms. Holt, it read. I was a junior developer at River Rock during your time there. I watched what they did to you and learned from it. When they tried to claim my optimization work last month, I remembered your documentation practices. Thanks to you, I kept my code and my dignity. They backed down when I showed them my paper trail. Thank you for showing us the way. I read it twice, feeling something I hadn't expected: hope. The lawsuit had been about protecting my own work, claiming my own value, but if it helped others do the same, then perhaps the impact went beyond the $9.5 million. I filed the email in a folder labeled "Worth It" and opened my development environment. A new client had sent over their codebase for review, and already I could see the vulnerabilities lurking in the shadows of their architecture. Tomorrow, I'd send them a detailed report with recommendations and cost estimates. They'd probably balk at some of the prices. They always did at first, but I'd explain, patiently and professionally, why each fix mattered. I'd document their responses, archive their decisions, and protect my recommendations. And if they chose to ignore my expertise, to penny pinch on security while hemorrhaging money on flashy features that added no value, well, that would be their choice. Their very expensive choice. But tonight, that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I had code to review, wine to drink, and the satisfaction of knowing that somewhere, Greg Lawson was probably lying awake, replaying that moment when he'd laughed at a $50 fix. I wondered if he'd learned anything from the experience. Probably not. People like Greg rarely did. They'd find someone else to blame, some other excuse for their failures. The security was too expensive. The engineer was too demanding. The lawsuit was unfair. But the numbers told a different story. $50 versus $9.5 million. Simple math that even a cost-cutting executive should understand. I raised my glass in a silent toast to documentation, to standing firm, to knowing your worth, and to the beautiful, brutal clarity of consequences. River Rock Logistics had taught me more through their failures than they ever had through their successes. And that education had been worth every penny of the $9.5 million they'd paid for it. The code on my screen beckoned, complex and challenging and full of potential. I set down the wine glass and got to work. There were vulnerabilities to find, systems to secure, and expertise to deliver. Somewhere out there, another Greg Lawson was making another short-sighted decision. Another engineer was being ignored, undervalued, discarded. Another $50 fix was being rejected in favor of executive ego. But also out there were the engineers who'd heard my story, who'd learned to document everything, who'd protected their work and demanded their worth. They were building better systems, securing critical infrastructure, and refusing to let their expertise be commoditized. The night stretched ahead, full of code and possibility. I typed steadily, methodically, each line clean and purposeful. No unnecessary flourishes, no trendy frameworks just for show. Just solid, secure, valuable work. Exactly what I'd always done. Exactly what River Rock had thrown away for $50. Their loss, my gain, 9.5 million times over. And tomorrow, I'd do it all again. Because that's what engineers do. We build. We protect. We document. And when someone tries to steal our work or ignore our expertise, we let the consequences speak for themselves. $50. One vulnerability. One arrogant executive. 9.5 million reasons to always document everything. The code flowed from my fingers like water, each function a small piece of a larger system, each system a testament to the value of doing things right the first time. Somewhere, Greg Lawson was learning that lesson the hard way. But I'd already moved on to the next problem, the next solution, the next opportunity to prove that expertise matters. Security counts, and documentation is the best insurance policy money can't buy until it has to. The story of the $50 fix would follow me for years. I knew it would open doors, start conversations, and serve as a warning to executives who thought they could cut corners on security. Good. Let it echo through conference rooms and board meetings. Let it make CFOs pause before rejecting critical patches. Because in the end, it was never really about the money. It was about respect for expertise, for security, for the people who keep the digital world running smoothly. Greg Lawson had shown none of that respect, and it had cost him everything. I saved my work, backed it up to 3 separate locations, old habits die hard, and finally called it a night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, I'd won. Not through revenge or sabotage, but through preparation, documentation, and the simple act of knowing my own value. $9.5 million, all because someone thought they could save 50. The lights in my study clicked off automatically as I left. Another small system working perfectly in the background. Just like good security should. Just like good engineers do. Until someone decides they know better. Then you get to learn exactly how expensive that decision can be.